There is a name history remembers with contempt, and yet it is also a name that teaches us something deeply uncomfortable about loyalty, power, and the moment a man finally looks in the mirror and sees what he has become. That name is Heinrich Himmler. And if you think you already know his story, I want you to stay with me, because what happened in the final weeks of the Third Reich is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a portrait of how even the most fanatical devotion can fracture under the weight of survival. I have spent years studying the men who surrounded Adolf Hitler, and I can tell you this without hesitation. None of them was more loyal, more obedient, more completely defined by their master than Heinrich Himmler. Not Göring with his medals and his vanity, not Goebbels with his sharp tongue and his poisonous pen, not Speer with his ambition and his blueprints for a world that would never be built. Himmler was different. He did not simply serve Hitler. He became Hitler's instrument of annihilation, willingly, methodically, and with the kind of cold administrative precision that makes the horror of it even harder to process. I want you to understand who Himmler was before the betrayal, because you cannot fully grasp what happened in April 1945 without understanding the decades that came before it. He was born in Munich in 1900, the son of a schoolteacher, raised Catholic, obsessed with order and discipline from childhood. He was not an imposing man physically, small, pale, with those round spectacles that made him look more like a bookkeeper than a killer. And in many ways, that was exactly what he was. He kept records. He filed reports. He built systems. What he built under Hitler's authority and with Hitler's complete trust was the infrastructure of mass murder. By the time the war began in earnest, Himmler controlled the SSC, the concentration camp system, and die Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the German army into Eastern Europe and murdered hundreds of thousands of people in the open fields, in the ravines, in the forests. He was not a man of impulse. He was a man of procedure, and that, perhaps, is what made him so valuable to Hitler and so utterly terrifying to everyone else. Hitler called him Der Treue Heinrich, faithful Heinrich. It was not an empty phrase. For years, Himmler justified that title completely. When Hitler needed something done that required no questions and no conscience, he turned to him. When the final solution was being constructed as policy, it was Himmler who translated the ideology into logistics, who turned the language of hatred into train schedules and gas chambers and detailed reports on killing rates. He attended the Wannsee Conference. He visited Auschwitz and watched the gassings personally, and then returned to his desk and continued his work. You have to sit with that for a moment. This was not a man acting under duress, a soldier following orders he privately despised. Himmler believed. He believed in racial ideology with the fervor of a convert. He built his SS into something he imagined as a secular order of knights, the ideological vanguard of a new civilization. He was obsessed with Germanic mythology, with ancient runes, with the idea that the SS was not merely a police force, but a brotherhood bound by blood and iron. And at the center of all of it, always, was Hitler. So, what happened? What causes a man so thoroughly devoted, so completely fused to another man's vision, to make the single most catastrophic decision of his life and attempt to negotiate peace with the Allies behind Hitler's back? The answer, I think, begins not in April 1945, but in 1943, when the war began to turn in ways that even the most committed believers could no longer ignore. Stalingrad had fallen. The Sixth Army was destroyed. North Africa was lost. The Allied landings in Sicily signaled what was coming. And while Hitler retreated further into fantasy, insisting that final victory was still possible, that the Allies would fracture, that secret weapons would change everything, the men around him began, quietly and separately, to recalibrate their sense of what the future might hold. Himmler was not immune to this. He was, after all, a man of calculation, and the calculation was becoming harder to ignore. Germany was losing. The war was not going to end in a triumphant parade through conquered capitals. It was going to end in rubble and ruin. And the question that Himmler began to ask himself, though he would never have admitted it openly, was what his place in that ruin might be, and whether there was any way out. The process was gradual, invisible, hidden beneath layers of continued fanaticism and public loyalty. As late as 1944, Himmler was still directing the extermination operations with bureaucratic efficiency, still signing off on deportations, still building the machinery of destruction. But something had shifted behind those round spectacles. A self-preservation instinct had awakened, and it would lead him to a decision that cost him everything. The first signs of Himmler's quiet departure from absolute loyalty came through his relationship with Felix Q, his personal masseur and physician. This is one of the stranger footnotes of the war. The fact that one of history's most powerful mass murderers was dependent on a Finnish Estonian masseur to relieve his chronic stomach cramps and neurological pain, and that this masseur became, over time, something like his conscience. Kirsten was no fanatic. He was a pragmatic man who used his access to Himmler to quietly negotiate the release of prisoners, including concentration camp inmates, and who gradually introduced Himmler to a reality the Reichsführer SS had been avoiding. Germany would lose, and what came after would be a reckoning. Himmler also began contact with a Swedish diplomat named Folkman. This is where the story reaches its decisive turn. In late April 1945, with the Soviet army closing in on Berlin and Hitler trapped in his underground bunker, Himmler met secretly with Bernadotte in the Swedish consulate in Lund. He had a proposal. He wanted to negotiate a surrender, not an unconditional one, mind you, but a negotiated peace with the Western Allies. He imagined that Britain and America might be willing to stop fighting, accept Germany's capitulation on the Western Front, and perhaps even collaborate against the Soviet Union. He offered himself as the man who could make this deal, the man who would hand over a defeated Germany in exchange for, presumably, some form of mercy, or perhaps even relevance in the new post-war order. It was a delusion of almost incomprehensible proportion. Himmler, the man who had overseen the Holocaust, who had signed the orders for the murder of millions, who was among the most wanted war criminals in the world, believed he could sit across from Allied representatives and negotiate as though he were a legitimate statesman. He believed that his organizational skills, his administrative efficiency, his ability to deliver the machinery of the Reich, somehow gave him a position from which to bargain. Bernadotte listened, and then did what any responsible diplomat would do. He transmitted the message to the Allied governments. And on April 28, 1945, a BBC broadcast announced to the world that Himmler had attempted to contact the Allies with peace proposals. In the bunker, Adolf Hitler received the news. I want you to imagine that moment. Hitler, who had trusted Himmler above all others, who had called him faithful Heinrich for over 2 decades, who had handed him the most absolute power in the Reich outside of his own Hitler, heard that his most loyal servant had tried to betray him. The reaction was volcanic. Hitler stripped Himmler of all his offices and titles. He declared him a traitor and ordered his arrest. He expelled him from the Nazi Party. In those last hours in the bunker, with everything collapsing around him, what consumed Hitler with particular fury was not the advancing Soviet army, not the imminent fall of Berlin. It was betrayal. Be there through a Heinrich. There is something almost tragically human in that. If you can separate it from the monstrous context, the most loyal man had broken faith. And in breaking faith, he had taken from Hitler something that perhaps mattered to him more than military victory, the illusion that he was surrounded by men who believed in him unconditionally until the end. But let us return to Himmler, because his story does not end with that BBC broadcast. After the betrayal was exposed, he found himself in a kind of limbo, stripped of power, hunted, a man without a role in the collapsing state he had helped build. He attempted to find a new position with the successor government under Admiral Dönitz, but he began wandering with a small entourage, trying to avoid capture, disguising himself, shedding his uniform and his identity. On May 21, 1945, traveling under a false name with a forged identity document, Himmler was stopped at a British checkpoint near Bremen. He was initially not recognized, but something gave him away, or perhaps something in him decided not to hide anymore. He revealed his identity. He was taken into British custody and transported for interrogation. On May 23, 1945, during a medical examination, Heinrich Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule concealed in his mouth. He was dead within minutes. The man who had built a system designed to process human beings as though they were industrial materials died in a British medical facility, wearing civilian clothes, with a false identity document in his pocket. He was 44 years old. I think about the arc of that life often, and what strikes me most is not the horror of what he did, though that horror is beyond measure, but the particular quality of his loyalty and what that loyalty actually was. We tend to romanticize loyalty, even when we are critical of the causes it serves. We understand at some level the soldier who follows orders, the officer who serves his country, the man who remains at his post even when the cause is lost. There is something in the human spirit that responds to constancy and commitment, even when we know it is misplaced. And for a long time, Himmler seemed to embody that constancy in its most extreme form. But his loyalty was never really to Hitler in any human sense. It was to the ideology, to the power structure, and above all, to himself. He served Hitler so completely because Hitler was the vehicle for everything Himmler wanted: authority, significance, the ability to impose his vision of the world on millions of people. When it became clear that vehicle was approaching a cliff, Himmler's loyalty evaporated with remarkable speed. He did not stand by his Führer in the bunker. He did not choose death at Hitler's side, as Goebbels did. He tried to save himself, and in trying to save himself, he revealed what his devotion had always been. Not loyalty, but utility. This is a lesson that transcends the Nazi period, though it is nowhere more clearly illustrated than in the Third Reich. Power does not inspire genuine loyalty. It inspires performance of loyalty. The men who surround the powerful are almost always calculating the distance between their own interests and the interests of the one they serve. When those interests align, loyalty looks absolute. When they diverge, you discover what was always there beneath the surface. Himmler is also a lesson in the psychology of perpetrators, a subject that historians and psychologists have struggled with for decades. He was not, in the clinical sense, a monster. He was a human being with human fears and human desires and human vulnerabilities. He suffered from stomach problems and headaches. He craved approval. He valued order because disorder frightened him. He built a philosophy of racial superiority in part because it gave him certainty in a world that might otherwise have been overwhelming. He was, in other words, recognizable, which is exactly what makes him so disturbing. The philosopher Hannah Arendt coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe Adolf Eichmann, the logistics coordinator of the Holocaust, during his trial in Jerusalem. The phrase has been debated and contested, but something of that quality attaches to Himmler as well. He was not a screaming fanatic. He was an administrator. He was methodical, precise, sometimes almost courteous. He gave speeches in which he acknowledged openly what he was doing, while simultaneously congratulating his men for having the strength to do it. He was aware, at some level, of the moral weight of what he was ordering, and he did it anyway, because he had convinced himself that history demanded it. What he'd never anticipated, what I think he was genuinely unable to process until it was too late, was that history was not going to vindicate him. He had imagined himself as a necessary figure in the construction of a new civilization. He ended up as one of the primary architects of one of the greatest crimes in human history, dying on a cot in a British field hospital. His empire dissolved, his Führer dead by his own hand, his cause obliterated, and his name a synonym for everything human civilization claims to stand against. There is one more thing I want you to consider before we close, and it is something that does not get discussed enough when we analyze the final days of the Third Reich. The betrayal that Himmler committed to Reich out to Bernadotte, the attempt to negotiate, was not only a personal betrayal of Hitler, it was also, in a strange way, a betrayal of the ideology he had spent decades serving. The final solution, the racial program, The entire edifice of Nazi ideology rested on the idea that there was no compromise with the perceived enemies of the German people, that the struggle was total and absolute, and could only end in victory or annihilation. When Himmler tried to negotiate, he was implicitly acknowledging that the ideology had failed, that the vision was wrong, that the world had not bent to the will of the master race and was not going to. He could not say that. Of course, he could not frame it in those terms. But that is what the act meant. And in that final, desperate negotiation, he was not just betraying Adolf Hitler. He was betraying everything he had ever claimed to believe in. He was proving, in the most complete way possible, that the faith had always been conditional. The man Hitler trusted most turned out not to have been faithful at all. He had been useful, and when he ceased to be useful, when the whole system was crashing down, the usefulness ended, and with it, the loyalty. Der treue Heinrich, the faithful Heinrich. History, as it so often does, had the last word.